let's look at specific information graphics and how can we utilize them to what we would say get the point across. So in this course, we will break apart information graphics into different categories, those being glances, graphs, maps, diagrams, and sequences. So those are sort of broad categories that we'll look at in depth as we go on and learn more about information graphics. So how about getting the point across? How do we do that? So we talk about the who, what, when, where, why, how, and how much. So those are questions that if we can answer those in a visual way, we've got ourselves an information graphic. Okay, so again, we're going to go back and look at each one of these specifically in more detail, breaking them apart into those different categories of information graphics. So to begin with our visual communications, we need to look at how to build these things. So our minds process and store symbols or graphics easier than decoding text. We know that. Nobody wants to read huge copies of text. We love it when we get an infographic that gives us the information super quick, super fast, straight to the point. So looking at how do we build these, what kind of sort of rules do we have to follow? One of those being the inverted pyramid. All right, inverted pyramid, not the way you think the proper pyramid should stand. We reverse it. And this is what we call in the design world or in the visual communication world, we call it the inverted pyramid because the largest piece is on the top. This is where we start with the main point. Okay, so we start with that main point, those visual elements that convey the graphic's essential information. It should be brief and to the point, and it should be understandable, especially understandable to a non-speaker of the language. That means we boil it down to only those very essential words. So when we're looking at headlines, we're talking about probably the main point. If there's some really strong graphic or even what we call a pointer box, a graphic call out that points to or summarizes an important fact, that could potentially be our main point. Secondary point, like the little chart here says, less important. So it's commonly reporting those underlining patterns. They are often stated as text, all right? Even if it's a graphic, it must be an overview. So most important, kind of the first thing we look at. Less important is those secondary points, and then we have supporting details, and those are the least important. And that's where we put in actual numbers in charted data, and really only those interested readers will be willing to search for those supporting details. So most of the time they will be kind of skipped unless that person has a personal stake, a reason for seeking out those details. So that tells us kind of some different types of people that look at our graphics, and we can actually break them into two main groups. All right, here's another example of how the inverted graphic is kind of read. So we see the main point, something's up with Swiss cheese. So here, the main point, we're talking about, holy cow, Swiss cheese is unusually airy. And so we've there's a record 23 holes per pound. All right, so some people may just get that main point and be on their way. Others that have a little bit of a stake will say the secondary point. They'll look at it, this could be a trend. It has twice as many holes as it did a few years ago. And then here's the supporting details. So only those people that are really interested, they have a personal stake. There's a reason for them to know. They will go on and look at those supporting details and see, in 1991, there were 18 holes. Okay, so again, another example here where we see kind of a main point, and these are really interesting. You can see I have the link at the bottom of these slides so you can go and investigate a bit more. But this is sort of an infographic on the inverted pyramid. So it's kind of an infographic on a graphic, kind of embedded. But you can kind of see main point, secondary point, supporting details, how the graphic is arranged. Now, that doesn't mean that our main point always has to be at the top in the center. We have a reading gravity, which means we do, in our culture, start at the top, move to the bottom, start on the left, move to the right. But that doesn't mean that's how we have to necessarily place our graphics. So even though we call it the inverted triangle and it looks like a triangle inverted or inverted pyramid, that doesn't mean that that's the way it should visually look as well. Okay, so let's talk about our types of people. We can break them into two big groups or two big categories. So we have those that have a personal stake in the issue. Those are the systematical approach, the systematical people. They will carefully pore over the details. They believe that it's going to personally affect me. I have this personal stake in this issue. They like things simple. They like things organized. Okay? You can kind of figure out this actually is a right brain, left brain dominance kind of thing as well, which we'll talk about in our next lecture next week. The heuristic people or the heuristic approach are those people that don't maybe have that personal stake, but they like the pretties. They think the issue really has little impact on them, to be honest, but then they feel, well, I don't have any control over it, so I'm not going to really worry about it, but I think that looks really cool. I like what we call chart junk or the clutter. I like those illustrations. I like those colors. I like that analogy. I like that slogan. So the heuristic people are all about the look. The systematical people are kind of looking for those details. Okay, so that's how we can break apart our audience. And when we look at a graphic, we'll see that there are different ways or design strategies. So if we're talking about vividness in our graphic, that means that it's attracting attention. And what audience do you think that fulfills? Okay, that probably fulfills the heuristic, the person that likes the pretty. Organization. So you rank information on importance. There's a hierarchy. And again, then those are the systematical people. Use of visual data metaphor. When you see that word visual there, of course, we're charting specific information, but it's visual. So the heuristic people are going to really like that. And then having it be simple, the simplicity of a data metaphor. Get rid of the chart junk. That's, of course, back to the systematic people. So if we look at an example here, the cheese with all the holes, that's a visual vividness. Okay? Visual hierarchy here. Looking at how it is organized. Okay, so there's some organization. And then the data metaphor and the metaphor simplicity. So if we again look at who likes what in terms of our two categories of audience, vividness and visual data metaphor are going to be those that are the heuristic people. The organization and the simplicity of the data metaphor are the systematic. So as designers, we have to really fulfill the needs of both. Okay, so that can be a little bit tricky because we have to make it look all cool and pretty, but we also have to have the ease of finding the information. So ways that we can sort of lie on our graphics, and I want everyone to know that one of the things that people have are opinions on charts and opinions on visual representation of information, and we as designers kind of get it because we can make it look the way we want it to look. And so we, always can make things look worse than they really are or look better than they really are. So as graphics, as building graphics and as a designer, there are some ethics involved that you have to make sure that you're showing data appropriately. Okay, so a couple of ways typical that things we can change how things look. The failing to account for inflation, making a price look as though it's risen sky high without even realizing, looking at inflation. Failing to clearly label projected figures. All right, so projections are only as valid as the credentials of the people doing them. So this is most frequently an error in graphics. Failing to use consistent scale. We'll look at all of these in more detail down the road. But for instance, there might be some charts or graphs that break the scale. So it sort of exaggerates. There's this big break in numbers, and so it looks like things are closer than they really are. Or starting at 180 rather than 0. Having it start not at my 0 point. All right. And that can make things, making that looks like a 5% drop, making it look like it's a 50% drop because of that failing to use a consistent scale. And then failure to make certain there's a valid common point of references, sort of that mixing apples with oranges. When do I need a graphic? So almost anything that appears in a newspaper, a brochure, a newsletter, on a website, in social media can have a graphic. Not all need one though. Okay, so if it answers sort of the who, what, when, where, why, how, and how much, that will give you the key indicator that maybe a graphic could be used. So graphics need to help tell the overall story. They need to make a contribution. If they don't help tell the story, then why are they there? So you kind of have to, make sure that you don't get distracted from the main point. And if they do, then they should be weeded out. Okay. The other mistake is that sometimes people think they only need a graphic if there are numbers. Not the case always. One thing we do know is that graphics are often created after the text has been written, but readers are likely to look at the graphic first to tell the story, to kind of get an overview. So those are a couple of things to think about. Now, one last thing to leave you with, and I know this is a little difficult to read. This is in your lecture notes on this section of the making a graphical point. So this breaks down some of those different types of graphics, and I want to just present this to you at this point and then know that we will talk about each one of these in detail. First thing that we'll cover when we start going through our information graphics is bio boxes, and they answer the question who, like key players, who's next, who's who, the victims, the heroes, join an elite group, and so they really recount some key points. So eventually, as we go through this semester and this course, we'll talk about each of these information graphics, and that will lead us to sort of being able to combine them into one piece. And that's what so commonly we talk about infographics today, really a key word today. So I pulled up some information here just to show you that we've got a lot of different types of visuals happening. This is actually some templates for creating infographics, and we can pull these templates actually into Illustrator. We'll look at doing that down the road. So you don't have to create everything from scratch. But you can see there are different ways that data is presented. Again, another example that we can show. So as we learn Illustrator as our tool and understand information graphics, we're going to be able to pull these things together to create some really cool pieces.